African Pavilion. This is on the just energy transition in low and middle income countries, insights from the UNEP emissions gap report. You know that is a flagship report of the UN Environment Programme, already done for the 13th time. And at this session we want to have a particular focus on the low and middle income countries, what they can do on supporting the transition, and in particular in a just way. The run of show is we have a presentation from Anne Olhoff, who is the scientific editor of the UNEP emissions gap report. And after that, we have a distinguished panel, which is already sitting here, but which I will introduce once we get there. So first, I hand over the floor directly to Anne Olhoff. She is, as I said, the scientific editor of the UNEP emissions gap report. Without her, the whole thing would not exist. So thanks for all your work in this, and we look forward for your summary on the gap report.
Thanks very much, Nicholas, and you're being way too kind. So I have the pleasure of giving you a brief overview of some of the key findings of this year's UNEP emissions gap report. And as Nicholas mentioned, it's actually the 14th time that the report comes out. So every year we produce this report based on massive support and efforts by a team. This year, 79 authors from 47 institutions across 23 countries contributed to the report. We publish it right before the COP meetings to inform the discussions here, and you can actually say that each year we are sort of doing a global stock take. And of course, we look at the emissions gap, which is basically the difference between where we're heading in terms of global emissions in 2030, if countries implement their current pledges, and where we need to be, according to science, to have a likely chance of achieving the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this year, it's an assessment report, I should also say. So it's an independent science-based assessment report based on the contributions of a great team of authors and also guided by a really engaged steering committee. We also give the countries that are specifically mentioned in the report the opportunity to comment on the findings before we publish the report. And of course, this year, one of the key issues, I thought I had another slide, is the global stock take. So the formal global stock take, and we went through quite a lot of effort in terms of looking at how could we best inform some of the discussions going here. So we're focusing not only on 2030, but also on what needs to happen in the next round of climate pledges that countries are supposed to put forward in just about 14 months from now, and which will include climate mitigation targets for 2035. And then we're also looking into changing trends in emissions, and what that means in terms of also bringing low and middle income countries on board a green transition in order to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement goal. But let's start having a quick look at what happened with global emissions. What we see is that global greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.2% between 2021 and 2022, reaching a new record high of 57.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. We also see that by now all sectors apart from transport have fully recovered by the drop in emissions induced by the COVID-19 pandemic and now exceed the previous record level in 2019. And then we see that emissions of methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases are increasing quite rapidly. At the same time, only 9 countries at the time of the cutoff date for our report had actually responded to the call to submit new or updated, strengthened NDCs. And if fully implemented, they are only assessed to reduce global emissions in 2030 by 0.1 gigaton of CO2 equivalents. Of course, if we look at the progress since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, it looks much better. Countries have strengthened their NDCs, and that is, if fully implemented, that will result in an annual reduction of 5 gigatons CO2 equivalents by 2030. We also see that the NDCs themselves have evolved. More include greenhouse gas emissions targets, there's greater coverage of both sectors and gases, and also that more include unconditional elements. However, it's been insufficient to narrow the emissions gap, which remains high and is basically the same size as last year, with small differences due to rounding. As you can see from this slide, the unconditional NDCs are associated with an emissions gap in 2030 of 14 gigatons of CO2 equivalent with respect to a 2-degree pathway, and of 22 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with respect to a 1.5-degree pathway. And that basically means that we would need to reduce emissions by somewhere between 28 and 42% over the next 7 years to get on track to the Paris Agreement goal. So that's basically 2030, and now this is, yep. But then let's look at what needs to happen in 2035. So if we just continue the current scenarios, the gap will deepen, it will become unbridgeable. And basically what we need from the next round of NDCs, what sort of the magic number, what countries collectively should target, is to reduce emissions by somewhere between 18 and 29 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in the next round of the NDCs if you compare to the current unconditional pledges. If we continue the scenarios over time, we just deepen the gap, it becomes unbridgeable, and it also means that we're currently headed for global warming way beyond the Paris Agreement goal. If we continue the efforts that are implied by current policies, we are only limiting global warming over this century to 3 degrees Celsius, and the full implementation of the unconditional and conditional NDCs will only limit global warming to somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees. So it's only really if we look at the most optimistic case that we include in the report based on what countries have pledged so far, and assume that countries fully implement their conditional pledges and their net zero emission pledges, that we get closer to the Paris Agreement goal and can limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius over the century. So what does that mean? What does that imply for action? It implies that we really need to focus on relentlessly strengthening mitigation action in this decade. And we have seen progress since the Paris Agreement in terms of policies being implemented and in terms of those policies actually reducing emissions trajectories. So by now, but at the time of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we estimated that global emissions would be 16% higher in 2030 based on current policies, and now we estimate it's 3% higher in 2030. So policy implementation is happening, and it is helping reduce emissions increase, but of course we need emissions to peak and then rapidly decline. So we need relentlessly strengthening implementation this decade because it will help narrow the emissions gap in 2030. It will also, at the same time, facilitate much more ambitious pledges for the next round of the NDCs and targets for 2035. And it will help pave the way to enhance the credibility and the feasibility of achieving the net zero emission pledges that countries have made and that by now cover about 80% of global emissions. And finally, we need it because if we end up at emissions level in 2030 associated with the current pledges, then we can wave goodbye to 1.5 degrees with no or low overshoot. We can basically not establish a pathway that achieves that if we end up at emission levels associated with the NDCs. For the past couple of years, the emissions gap report has looked much into transformations, global transformations. And global transformations of energy systems is essential. I can't really see the slide. I hope the figure is on it. Maybe it's missing. Okay, we had a really nice figure here, and Greg can tell you more about it, showing the committed emissions from existing coal, oil, and gas infrastructure here. But basically, the energy system accounts for about 86% of global CO2 emissions. So without that, without reducing emissions from energy, we're not going to get anywhere. And we also need, of course, the high-income, high-emitting countries to move faster forward. But we also need to bring the rest of the world along the line, because by now, low- and middle-income countries account for 69% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that makes this question that we're going to discuss in the panel of how do you bring about energy transitions that are just and that also achieve, or basically they're driven by development choices, right? So we need to make the right development choices that align development and a low carbon future. And that's where also Jakob, who's on the panel, he can go much more into detail on this. He was one of the lead authors of this panel. We also find in the report that the preparation of the next round of NDCs provides an opportunity for countries to put forward much more concrete plans and much more concrete even investment plans for what is needed for our countries to actually drive a green transition and accelerate it. And we see that access to affordable finance, of course, is a prerequisite for raising mitigation ambition in low and middle income countries. We see that the cost of capital is very much higher in many countries than in Europe and the US, for instance. And I think the figure is missing here as well. So I'm just going to say we also have a chapter this year that focuses on carbon dioxide removal, which will become increasingly important later in the century to actually achieve first zero emissions and then net zero emissions. I'll leave it here in the interest of time, and just thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this rundown. Have a look at the full report on the internet. You will definitely find it there. But now let's go to our distinguished panel. And we have really quite a good lineup here of experts on this topic, in particular in the low and middle income countries, because I would assume that there are very particular challenges that lie ahead to implement them here. Let me introduce to you the panel. From my far end, we have Fatima Denton. She is from the United Nations University Institute on Natural Resources in Africa. And then next is Neil Cole. He's from the presidency of the Republic of South Africa and working on the JETP, so the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Then we have Greg Mutic from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and he is one of the lead authors of the report. Actually, I forgot, Fatima as well also contributed to the report. Next, we have Jin-Soon Lim from the International Energy Agency, and last but not least, Jakob Mulugeta from the University College of London, also lead author of the report. So quite a few authors here present and others who can provide very interesting insight. I will go along the same order in the panel and will ask you on your insights on this. So, yeah, what are the main challenges or main opportunities in low and middle income countries, and how can you support this transition in a way that it leaves nobody behind? Fatima, maybe you can kick us off.
Hello. Okay, it works. My voice almost scares me. I guess let me first start off by saying that the current systems that we have in place, whether we're talking about energy systems or water systems, all the systems that we need as transitional levers are systems that are almost hardwired in injustices. So we really have to make a really huge effort to make the adjustments necessary and to ensure that the systems are not going to deliver on unjust outcomes. So that's a real danger, and we have to really work harder at that. That said, in terms of opportunities, I mean, for us, most of our work has actually focused on stranded assets because we see this as a real sort of double-edged sword. On the one hand, more than, I would say, half of the oil and gas countries in Africa rely for almost more than 50%, on export revenue that are coming from oil and gas. So the big question is, what do you say to countries like Nigeria, I mean, an established oil and gas country, that relies almost over 90% of its export revenue that's coming from there? What replaces that? It's a huge hole. What do you also say to countries like Senegal? It's a new entrant, and it's also coming into the sort of arena of exploitation of these resources. So my take is that we need to see how developed countries can support developing countries in deprioritizing some of these energy-intensive sectors, and it's not going to happen overnight. But you know, we've been talking for a while that the transition needs to be managed. We also have to realize that there's a whole set of implications for the banking sector because most mining industries are tied to banks. It also has implications on currency because the currency is also tied to a dollar currency, and therefore most currencies tend to depreciate. The argument for most countries in Africa is that gas is relatively clean, and therefore they see it as a transitional fuel which will help them get into green industrialization on the one hand, but also it would help them provide steady supply of energy resources. Demand for energy will become higher in Africa, over 30% by 2040. So how do you meet this demand in a continent, you know, the paradox of the plenty, there's huge amounts of energy, different sources of energy, but in terms of real utilization of these energy, we find that we have over 600 million people that haven't got any access to clean energy. So my sense is that the transition is not a linear one. It's not a painless one. It will be difficult. It will be complex. It's not going to be orderly. All those fine words. It's not the last time I was talking about one of the stations here that says equity, you know, destination equity. We're not just going to get into a train and head to equity. It's going to be complicated. But I think that there are ways that we can make it less difficult and supporting countries in terms of decarbonizing their energy systems would be useful. I think some of the ambition related to the green minerals, the critical minerals as well, is also important, but we have to ensure that we don't produce outcomes that resemble some of the things we've seen in the past, because this has been a huge story of predation. So you know, one company is coming, multinationals coming, and basically providing a lot of the funds, and then the countries where the resources are found are not basically owners of those resources because they're already in very difficult circumstances of debt and debt repayment, etc. So for me, it's a combination of things, but it's certainly not a hopeless story. It certainly can be a very hopeful story, but it really does depend how we allow countries in Africa, especially, to exploit and at the same time go into a parallel direction of decarbonizing. I don't think it would be realistic to expect them overnight to leave their resources in the ground, so they will have to have this dual track. We've done a study which is coming out soon. South Africa was one of our case studies, where we find that the ambition of countries in Africa is quite high towards mitigation. They actually have different government policies, you know, that are actually geared towards decarbonization. And South Africa is one of those countries that can be, you know, seen as a front runner. And there are others, you know. So it doesn't mean that countries are just waiting to exploit resources. They are actually taking some proactive stands and steps to reduce their emissions. So I think they just need to have that support, and it's in the infrastructure support, it's in the financial support, it's in terms of skills. It's a whole suite of things, but it has to be a managed process. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, and South Africa is a good cue because next online is Neil Cole, working on the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa. And there, I think, when the JETP was announced, people had very, very high hopes that this is a very concrete thing. There's partners working together, and so it's often, well, at that time was seen as a blueprint. I would be super interested to hear more about the details of it and what you think works well and what we should do better next time. Neil.
Thank you very much, and I hope that your hope is still high. We will be, over the next 2 or so days, we will be launching and speaking in greater detail on the investment plan. So I'm not just in the presidency, I'm in a unit that's responsible for implementing the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And we've just finalized our implementation plan, which sets out in terms of the portfolios that we've identified in the investment plan. We've added 2 new portfolios, and in the implementation plan, we set out a roadmap for each of those portfolios in a very practical way in terms of what we need to achieve over the next 5 years. And I always remind people that it's a plan, and all plans need a time frame, and all plans need to be costed. Yes, they need to be ambitious, but it is about setting out what it is that you're going to achieve over a time frame. And in your plan, you are promising what it is that you're going to be doing. And I always say, my background's in public finance, and I always say that, you know, one of the worst budget mistakes you can make is to promise what you cannot deliver on. So I hope that what we've promised to achieve over the next 5 years is what we're going to be able to deliver on. It's not going to be easy. There are many complexities, many known unknowns, many unknown unknowns. And I think we've been able to think very carefully through and come up with what are the steps that are required to deal, especially with some of those unknowns. Let me make 3 quick points in relation to challenges, barriers, and suppose what you want, and that is what needs to be done. And just to pick up from Fatima, the first is the need for loads and loads of innovation in order to accelerate the just energy transition. And I think we have, in our reforms that have been undertaken, we've been innovative. I think we've struggled with implementation in many of them, but I think the promise is still there, and I think we're still on the right track in terms of some of those innovative reforms. I mean, the first is the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. It's put about 6 gigawatts of renewable energy onto the grid and about 16 gigawatts that's in the pipeline. And I think we need to be a bit more innovative in order to unblock those gigawatts that are of renewable energy that's in the pipeline. The recent announcement in terms of lifting the cap on distributive generation, and also the incentives that are provided for businesses and households to install solar systems has been innovative. And I'm told that in a recent statistic that we've imported the equivalent in solar panels that is equal to what on average our coal power stations produce. So I mean, just sort of in about 2.5 gigawatts of solar panels that have been imported in South Africa. And this has to do with the legislation and the reforms that have been put in place. The second, and to say that maybe, yeah, I mean, I think the JETPs, I think it's been innovative. I think we need to be making them work. And I think the way that you make them work is to give them a local flavor and not see it as a blueprint across all countries. The second is, what I think is required is the reorientation of development finance for multilateral development banks, for DFIs. It cannot just be business as usual, and it cannot just be an increase in the quantum of existing instruments. I think it's about also improving the quality and looking at how The types of financing instruments provided by development finance institutions and MDBs can be used more strategically to crowd in private investment. With the state of public finances in many developing countries, we're not going to be able to just provide these sovereign guarantees for the type of products that are provided by MDBs. So we need to be working with MDBs in a way that comes up with more innovative ways in how we're going to unlock that type of financing. And then the last, which and is particularly pertinent for South Africa, and that is local government capacity. Our local governments in South Africa manage about 60% of our distribution grid, and there's a need for a massive investment that is required on the maintenance of the distribution grid to prepare local governments to carry out their constitutional role and to make them ready for the transition is going to require a very significant effort. So we've included in the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan municipalities or local governments as a portfolio because of the kind of capabilities that are going to be required for local authorities. And yeah, I mean, you're all obviously invited to tomorrow and Tuesday when we're going to be speaking more on our implementation plan. And I think it is about, how do you get to the nuts and bolts of implementing at a country level the just energy transition. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's what you always expect. No, the devil is in the detail. It's a great idea, but really implementing it is very difficult and country specific. Next one is Greg Mutit from IISD. What are your views on what we can do to help middle and low income countries to get this transition done?
Thanks, Nicholas, and thanks, Fatima and Neil, for your great remarks. I was very fortunate in the Emissions Gap Report to collaborate with Jessie Burton of the University of Cape Town. We co-led Chapter 5, and she's one of the foremost global experts on the subject we're discussing today. I'm afraid you're less fortunate. She couldn't make it to the COP, but I'll do my best to try and reflect our thinking. I'd like to say a little bit about barriers, and then about opportunities, and then about pressure points. In terms of barriers, I want to mention two. And the first of them, I think we really can't stress enough, which is finance. And what we really need is finance that is sufficient, finance that is affordable, and finance that is targeted, those three things. And we're not seeing enough of that as yet. I would say that is the largest barrier to progress on just energy transitions in low and middle income countries. The second barrier I want to mention is grids. Where to decarbonize the system, I think we need both stronger and larger grids and significantly more investment to make a ramping up of renewables possible. In terms of opportunities, I think renewable energy offers fantastic opportunities. If we can overcome the problem of cost of capital, it offers the cheapest way to generate electricity. It's particularly well suited to distributed solutions that can fill access gaps, especially in remote areas. It can be applied in a modular way, so it is well integrated with countries' development plans and pathways. But to do so, we have to overcome the finance and grids barriers. And that brings me on to pressure points, where I'm going to build on what Neil said. I think one of the most important is international public finance. We've seen some progress on this front, but I think we need to see a lot more. 2 years ago at COP26, 34 governments and 5 international financial institutions committed to end public finance for fossil fuels and replace it with financing clean energy. Now, they've done reasonably well, those 39 governments and institutions, on the first part of that, and not so well on the second part of that. Most of them, for the most part, have have phased out their financing of fossil fuels, but they haven't sufficiently built up the financing of clean energy in its place. A recent report by my colleagues at IASD called Putting Promises into Practice, it found that of those 39 institutions, only 2 have increased their clean energy finance by more than they've decreased their fossil finance. And that's a problem. So the first element of finance we need is sufficient quantity. Secondly, we need that to be affordable. Much of even the public finance that is going into just energy transitions is at commercial or semi-commercial rates. We need to see a much larger portion of it at concessional rates. And the third is it needs to be targeted. Well, I've said it's insufficient. The public finance that is flowing, too much of it is going where it's not most needed. It's going into renewable energy generation projects in the countries that are perceived as less risky. And that is where it serves the least function. That's where private finance finds it easiest to go. And what we need it to do is to de-risk areas that are in reality or in perception the riskiest, so as to crowd in the private finance. We need it to be focusing especially on the enabling investments in transmission and in grid management. And so unlocking the strategic role that public finance can really play here. And so that's where I'd like to really see progress in the coming years.
Thank you. So the crux is the money again, and apparently, you showed the slide with high interest rates, no? The cost of capital, that's also something that you said, Neil, the money, the financing, the working with the MDBs is probably a very important element there. Thanks. Then Jin-Sun Lim from the International Energy Agency. How do you see it? What can the International Energy Agency do? What are the big obstacles? And give us some hope here, what we can do. Wait a second, maybe your mic is not working. Test again. Yeah.
Great. Actually, several days ago, International Energy Agency published an article, so what would be the key success factor for the COP28 and also the clean energy transitions? And we were talking about 5 things. The first thing is about the tripling renewable energy capacity, installed capacity, and second, a doubling energy efficiency improvement rate, and the third is the reducing methane emission reduction by 75%, and fourth is just an orderly decline of the fossil fuels, and the fifth is about the money again. And it's about the tripling clean energy investment in developing and emerging economies. And I would like to actually emphasize that part again, because I just wanted to emphasize that part because it's way cheaper solution, which means a way more cost-effective solutions to achieve the clean energy transitions and also meet the climate goals. Because according to our reports, we found out actually reducing 1 gigaton of the greenhouse gas emissions, it's way cheaper, actually almost a half of the price in developing and emerging economies. Thanks to they have more opportunities about installing a renewable energy capacity and more energy efficient technologies. So that's why it gives more cost-effective solutions. That's why we need to increase the clean energy investment because this is more effective and more feasible way. And I also would like to raise one part about the just and orderly decline of the fossil fuels. Because when we are talking about the just energy transition, we need to also think about the people in the emerging and developing economies. And what we found from our World Energy Employment Report, which is actually just a few days ago launched, this is my boss's report that I strongly recommend you to try it, check it. And that one is clearly shows that the clean energy transition will create more jobs. Actually, the new jobs, the number of the newly created jobs will outweigh the reduced number of jobs in the fossil fuel industry. But still, which means that some of the people who are already working in the fossil fuel industry may need to move to the solar PV or wind turbine or something more energy efficient technologies. And the issue is that for those people, this could be a really big issue because energy industries, compared to other industries, it requires more high-skilled labor. So those kind of capacity building programs and high skill development, those kind of technology support and capacity building support is very much needed. And also, I would like to flag that solar PV and wind turbine, they are pretty climate sensitive technologies. So which means that heat waves, sometimes solar PV is not really working perfectly over the 35 degree of the heat waves. And also wind panels are, wind turbines, sometimes they are quite vulnerable to the tropical cyclones. And many of the developing and emerging economies, they are also very much climate vulnerable countries. So when they are installing those kind of new technologies, we need to also consider climate resilience and climate risks as well. And sometimes those kind of information and capacity building is a little bit missing in that area. So we need to think about those kind of issues to achieve just an orderly decline of the fossil fuels and also clean energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Jakob, how do you see it? What are your main insights on how we can do the just energy transition in the low and middle income countries without leaving anybody behind?
Thanks. I think I've been left with scraps to deal with because everyone has covered a lot of the things that I wanted to say. I'm just kidding. Yeah. I mean, I would like to start with perhaps, you know, the kind of narrative itself in the way that it's being articulated. And to some extent, you know, all of us are hostage to that. You know, a lot of the conversations that we have, sometimes, you know, you wonder and imagine, you know, what, you know, for example, just transition means, you know, for the ordinary person in, you know, in Guinea-Bissau or Mali or Ethiopia and so forth. So there is a kind of disconnect in terms of the way we are articulating the problem in terms of, you know, gigawatt hours and megawatt and so forth. We get lost in these details. But I would like to kind of, you know, maybe emphasize that perhaps, you know, to bring back the whole question around services for people as if people matter. So bring, you know, people at the center of our conversations, because sometimes, you know, it does get lost. So I think, you know, we do have a narrative challenge to be able to deal with. The second point I wanted to make was, I mean, when Narasimha and I were involved in the chapter dealing with the LMIC countries, what we realized was that, of course, you're talking about, you know, countries with very different starting points and very different pathways. You know, you've got countries that are fossil fuel exporting countries. Others are, you know, predominantly of fossil fuel users, such as South Africa, for instance. Then you have some other countries that are renewable energy focused, you know, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so forth. And then others are importers. So we're looking at very different configuration of countries, each of them requiring different responses and different pathways. Now, one thing that I think, which hasn't been said just yet, is perhaps, you know, on the question of capacity itself. You know, that within countries, institutions are so weak, and human capability, not the ability of people, but rather the way in which, you know, they operate within institutions is quite problematic, and therefore a lot of data and analysis and therefore, you know, the planning process that goes into making those long-term projections is often not done within countries. It has a kind of an external institutional hand-holding that goes on. So I do think that a very critical thing that needs to happen is institutions need to be strengthened, and also, you know, capability within countries needs to be boosted. That way, what you will have is that, you know, then you can have a sensible conversation about what type of a future makes sense for a particular country. You can really carry on conversations based on objective conditions within specific countries. So I think that's one area, in addition to what everyone has said, that I would like to add to this conversation. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot. So making the point on capacity that is definitely needed to be supported. We have a little bit of time for questions. So are there any questions in the audience to the panel on what we've heard so far? Any questions? No, then, well, there's one. Otherwise I would have get some out of my head, but here we are. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Okay, hello, I'm Bombo Luhembe from APSA. Just a question, there has been a lot of comment around the cost of the new and cleaner energy that is cheaper compared to the traditional energy. My question is that considering just transition, when we calculate the cost of that energy, do we take into consideration the social cost? Because that is what just transition is all about. And I just want to understand if that is calculated. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. I mean, in theory, it's probably cheaper, but there's a lot of things around. We had heard already cost of capital, but you add now social costs. Anybody who wants to take it from the panel? Greg?
It's a great question. So when some of us commented that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels, we're referring to the levelized cost of energy, which is the cost of generating one unit of power. And inherently, that doesn't measure the transitional cost. And so one thing we really need to emphasize is that also needs investment to make sure people aren't left behind, to enable workers to get quality jobs in the new sectors, and so on. So renewable energy, if you're going to build a power plant, the cheapest form of power plant, a new power plant, the cheapest form of generation you can build is wind or solar in most areas of the world. And where that isn't the case, it's because of the cost of capital problem. But a lot of countries have large proportions of their workforce tied up in fossil fuel energy. And so in those countries, a just transition is particularly important. And the elements of a just transition have to include an inclusive process that is built with those who are affected by it, that provides social protection for people during the course of the transition. Of course, it includes retraining. I think a lot of people reduce just transition to the idea of retraining, and I think that's a mistake. And a fourth element of it is investing in the new sectors that create those quality jobs.
Okay, thanks a lot. We are a bit pressed in time and we need to stop right away. But let me get one more question, and Jakob wanted to answer as well, so let's try.
Gerd Leipold from Climate Transparency. The emission gap report stresses the point that the development of the energy system in low and middle income countries is dominated by a development agenda, and fully understand what is there. Two questions related to that. And you mentioned the narrative, how to speak about this transition. To what extent should the narrative address only development or also climate? But the more serious question I might ask myself, the development agenda is not necessarily fully aligned with a climate agenda. So when you formulate the objectives, your targets, your ambition for the energy sector, how do you find the balance? What is the political process in order to do that and in also to achieve that both objectives are being met?
Thanks, Gerd. Maybe you take that directly. Jakob.
Yeah, I mean, I perhaps what I was going to say earlier, in addition to what Greg said, might pick up on this. But I think, when discussing the issue of justice or just transition of the energy sector, there's a tendency to focus on the downstream end of the spectrum. But I think, when you're talking about particularly Africa, and Fatima mentioned it, briefly, is you do have a question around, for instance, critical minerals. What is the role of countries in Africa to engage with the whole question of processing and manufacturing and building an industrial base that would then generate the kind of jobs and opportunities. And I think, the justice envelope should extend beyond the consumption level, but also at the production side of the spectrum. The idea that somehow, African countries can, transition using technologies that have been imported, having exported the raw minerals, processed them in China, and imported the finished products, whether it's China or Germany, doesn't make much sense. We more or less continue to be locked into the same old, extractive type of economy. So I think there are issues there that are quite important to try and extend this question beyond where our conversation is at the moment. I know it's quite difficult because then you enter into a whole host of, well, who finances it, all these questions. But I do think that this is an area where some more work needs to be done. I think on the question of where do you start, I think where you start is to have a genuine conversation within countries in terms of what type of an energy, what type of an economy, what type of a society would you like to construct, and then work your way backwards from there towards the energy system. I think starting with the energy system is just looking at the problem at the wrong end of the spectrum, but rather the question should be, what is the vision of a society in the future, and then begin to sort of figure out how do you get there. I think in that moment, of course, you begin to introduce questions around development and and the whole question of climate change and living within limits. Those questions, and that would be the best way to a good way to try and attempt something new, perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And time's already almost up, and we need to close in time. But I want to give the speakers one more opportunity to say one sentence. For me, it's really important that we kind of give each other a little bit of hope that we can do this. And so my question for you, and you have one sentence, is what gives you hope that we can achieve this sustainable and just energy transition in the low and middle income countries? Start with you, maybe, Fatima.
Okay. Well, I think for me, I see a genuine, how should I put it? There's this sentence that comes to mind always about the collective action and aspiration towards low emissions and low carbon development. And I think even though countries might do something differently within their borders, I think this is a rallying point. People come here with aspiration. And I think that for me, that aspiration is something that's hopefully going to take us to that destination point we want to get to. So that gives me hope, yeah.
Great, aspiration. Neil, what's yours?
Sentences there. But mine is, in developing our implementation plan in South Africa, I think a couple of lessons for us is that we have to pay attention to the local context, because that would give us an understanding in terms of what is going to work, when and how. We need to be open to partnerships within the country, largely between the public and the private sector, and then also open to international partnerships in order to share experiences, to learn from each other, and also to ensure that there is that solidarity that is required in order to achieve the transition.
Great. So cooperation and solidarity. What's yours, Greg?
Well, I think it's quite clear from this discussion that we have the solutions. And what's needed on top of that is political will. My hope is that, I don't know, but I hope I'm detecting a bit of a change in tone at these negotiations, driven by the sheer urgency of how close we're getting to 1.5. I'm going to take the liberty of mentioning the missing figures from Anne's presentation. We're about to discuss those in an event next door in Building 87 in the UNEP Pavilion. I didn't mention them in my remarks, but join us if you'd like to know more about fossil fuels or carbon dioxide removal.
In 15 minutes, that is.
Yep.
Exactly, that's why we need to close. But first we hear from Jin. What makes you hopeful?
I think my answer would be pretty similar. The door is closing very rapidly towards a 1.5 target, but we have many methods to make it still open. So we can guarantee that there are existing clean energy technologies are sufficient enough to meet the 1.5 targets, and we have all the financial resources. But we want to make it directed and used in a proper way.
And Jakob?
For me, it's young people globally who are energized, and I've lost hope with the previous generation, so the future generation is what I'm banking on. Thank you.
That's a very good one and a very good last word. Thank you all for this. It was a very good session. If you want to know more about the UNEP emissions gap report, just go next door to the UNEP Pavilion. In 15 minutes, there's another session on it. Thanks a lot and have a good day.